remember like watching like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or at least the full movie with an old neighbor of mine, and I thought it was hilarious. The one of my favorite parts from that movie, which was the most memorable to me, was of course the killer rabbit of Carbonite, because like who wouldn't remember such an event? Yeah, especially funny because I actually used to have pet rabbits when I was younger, though I don't recall if any of them were fully white like that particular rabbit. But although well, they did nip and bite at times if they were annoyed or got really aggressive. But I'm pretty sure they would never eat like or even kill humans. At least like, well, or at least not us. Hopefully. Alright, though we don't have them anymore. We have a very silly dog, which some of you already know, at least from my previous videos, like Haru. Yeah, so I thought it would be kind of funny to, I guess, maybe like recite a quote from the killer rabbit scene, because well, why not? Especially since like the scene which involves the holy hand grenade of Antioch, where apparently the supposed like Bible, or the supposed like book of the Bible, or at least the King James Bible, was like it's apparently called the Book of Armaments, which does sound plausible, like at least like when it comes to like the books in the Bible. It's just funny because I myself am Christian, and I have read the Bible like many times, so I think it would be kind of funny to see if I could kind of like quote it in a serious tone, well, as serious I can get, especially given how it's written to parody the King James Bible specifically, which I personally use as my like main source for reading, or at least for church. Anyway, like so, and now I'm going to read this particular book, or at least particular verse, if it could even be called one, given how it's only recited literally just once in the movie. And Saint Attila raised the hand grenade up on high, saying, O Lord, bless this thy hand grenade, that with it thou mayest blow thine enemies into tiny bits in thy mercy. And the Lord did grin, and the people did feast upon the lambs and sloths and carps and anchovies and orangutans and breakfast cereals and fruit bats and large oh wait, no, we got skipped there. Sorry. And the Lord spake, saying, First shalt thou take out the holy pin, then shalt thou count to 3, no more, no less. 3 shall be the number thou shalt count, and the number of the counting shall be 3. 4 shalt thou not count, neither count thou 2, excepting that thou then proceed to 3. 5 is right out. Once the number 3, being the third number, be reached, then lobbest thou thy holy hand grenade of Antioch towards thy foe, who, being naughty in my sight, shall snuff it. Amen. The Book of Armaments, Chapter 2, verses 9 to 21. I think the one funny, if not accurate part of that particular scene is that they constantly repeat how the person holding or using the holy hand grenade has to count to 3, but they keep repeating it or paraphrasing it every few like seconds, which is funny because the real King James Bible does something like that, but only to emphasize on certain instructions that God would give to his people, or at least to his prophets and messengers, which is like kind of funny, and though it does get a bit annoying over time, but I don't know, like as you read, or as I read it more, I kind of like got used to it at this point. One fairy tale that stood out to me, even compared to others like Jack and the Beanstalk, Goldilocks, and etc. Like the one story that intrigued me the most was Red Riding Hood, or Little Red Riding Hood, or Little Red, or whatever you call her, and the variations that tended to appear regarding this particular story. And it's kind of funny considering how it was also one of our subjects that I had to learn for one of my English courses, at least like during my, I think, fall term, I believe, as it was a few months before I finally graduated. Right, I don't know why. I guess it was because it was one of the more common folk or fairy tales, along with it featuring like the usual plot where Little Red ends up going to see her granny, the wolf attacks her, and Little Red ends up being eaten alongside her grandmother, yet somehow survives. And the wolf is usually killed by a huntsman or a woodcutter who happen to be nearby. Right, so that's the usual story. But there are some that don't have Little Red or even her grandmother survive, as like in the early version, like the Charles Perrault, which is the French version called Little Red Riding Hood, she and her grandmother unfortunately get like, eaten, and that's literally how the story ends. And it's supposed to have a moral regarding how the wolf is basically a metaphor for like predators, and not just the animalistic ones, but anyone who's seen as dangerous or cunning, and how children, especially as it states, well-bred young ladies should never talk to strangers and should be dangerous of the wolves in the world, which is like understandable, especially with the whole like stranger danger kind of motif. However, the ironic thing is that the Grimm's Brothers version, Little Red Cap, it actually has a happy ending, despite how most of their versions of fairy tales often ended like in tragedy, or at least it just got really dark later. Though while this one is no darker than the others. However, in this one, this is one of the few that has two wolves attack both Little Red and her grandmother. And however, while the first time they do get saved by the huntsman, however, the second time they are forced to protect themselves by another wolf who tries to pull the same trick, only for Red to learn from her mistakes and instead run away. Unfortunately, the wolf is determined, or at least the second wolf is determined to eat her and her grandmother at the same time, like no matter what. So, however, they're able to trick the wolf into basically falling into a large trout or pot of some kind, thus basically boiling him alive. So yeah, it's very interesting how like, yeah, you could say this is an early version of like, say, a badass Red Riding Hood. But then again, there are various other ones, such as like Hoodwinked, where Red Riding Hood is shown to be like basically a martial arts master, along with having a lot of sass like with her. But then again, her granny is the same thing, and the sequel, which wasn't really well liked, though I personally didn't mind it, where it turns out they apparently studied at some kind of ancient kind of like sisterhood known as like the Sisterhood of Kung Fu Bakers, which apparently is the reason why they are so good at martial arts. But anyways, like there are also other versions, such as like the, I guess, well, I can't think of it at the top of my head, but there are variations of these particular stories, such as like some involving a wolf, like, well, instead of a wolf, it's an ogre or a troll of some kind. You know, whereas in others, well, there was this one version that I read, which was probably the lightest and I guess the most kid-friendly, where in that version, like Little Red, she ends up actually redeeming the wolf, where while the wolf like did intend to eat both her and her granny, like in this version, the granny ends up being locked inside a closet like for safekeeping, whereas Little Red, she ends up like still not realizing what happened to her granny, and she however, in this version, she ends up basically kind of like befriending the wolf, albeit unintentionally, by rubbing his ears, and as she believed that he was still her sick grandmother, and the wolf is so touched by her kindness that he actually refuses to eat her, though the granny, she ends up like basically arriving back in the room to grab the girl and tell the wolf to get out of her house, even though the wolf didn't do anything. And because this version of the wolf is like ashamed of what he almost did, he ends up leaving the house unscathed with no huntsman to protect him. So I thought it was interesting, right? And there's also the Into the Woods version, where the wolf, he ends up getting killed by both Red and like Granny, along with the baker. And the Granny is shown to be rather bloodthirsty when it comes to like killing the wolf, which is yeah, it was just kind of funny considering how you think the old lady would not really be that much of a threat, but in this case she kind of is. And as a result, like Red, she ends up wearing the wolf's pelt as her, I guess, like riding hood instead of the usual kind of like red cape that she had earlier. Though interestingly enough, the like I myself am actually planning on creating a fairy tale themed story on my own. Yeah, where it'll take elements from older fairy tales, like, or more specifically, the Grimm's version, for reasons that are kind of like a spoiler. Like, but in this case, like Red, she ends up meeting like a wolf. However, he's actually good in this version and basically becomes her ally. Though why is also a bit of a spoiler, but let's just say he has a connection to both her and her grandmother. And I guess it'll have elements of maybe Ruby as well, but with less sci-fi and more fantasy, as it's loosely inspired by fairy tales, but with a unique twist. Though it's not a modernized one, but rather it sort of harkens back to like the time period that they were based in, like possibly like a medieval European kind of story. But nonetheless, I wanted to put my own unique take on these old stories, as we're so used to the usual plot formula that the idea of them being changed randomly is unexpected, which is exactly the point. Though technically my Red Riding Hood story won't be like the first, but rather it'll, I guess, chronologically be the second, where I plan on starting my whole fairy tale themed stories with Jack and the Beanstalk that will also have a radically changed storyline, and you could say a much happier but at the same time more bittersweet version. For that is a spoiler, and you could say a story for another time. Oh yeah, one more thing I want to talk about is that for my English course, like while I did have to read Red Riding Hood, I also had to read like this kind of short story, which was a very dark and very mature take on Red Riding Hood, called like In the Company of Wolves, where like in that version the wolf already ate the grandmother, but this version of Red Riding Hood, she actually doesn't care about her grandmother being eaten, but rather she's actually charmed by the wolf, as he's apparently a werewolf of some kind, especially since she ends up becoming his mate instead of being his enemy, and she doesn't even try to avenge her grandmother or even go back, as it's implied that she decides to stay with him and his pack, especially when his pack members start showing up to the house. Yeah, and the way that like Red, she ends up like joining the wolf and I guess pulls a face heel turn to be with him, it's kind of reminiscent of how at the end of the Hannibal story, or at least the book version of Hannibal, like instead of the movie, where Clarice, she ends up like turning evil, or rather she ends up being, I guess, like charmed by Hannibal's advances and willingly becomes his lover instead of being like, instead of like being his enemy, like in the movie series, where apparently it's hinted that she had become somewhat cynical after working as the FBI, so that may have been the reason. But nonetheless, like, it's possible that Red Riding Hood might have gone through something similar, as it's a very kind of grim version, as the granny is clearly killed, right? But Red is rather disturbingly unaffected by it, and instead more intrigued by like the werewolf, or I guess maybe to almost like Twilight levels, but let's not go there because I really don't like talking about Twilight. Another funny thing is that our creative writing class had to read a page of Twilight to show just how bad the writing is. Yeah, and even reading it myself like made me feel a bit sick or just really cringy. Yeah, and I saw one of the comments as we were doing a virtual classroom where one of the commentators said that reading it made them want to barf. Yeah, that's how bad it was. Yeah, though, well, I do feel kind of sorry for like the author of Twilight, but hey, like, I mean, what can you do with writing like that? So, yeah.